Everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thanks for watching. So in this video, I'm going to continue my discussion of John Locke, the 17th century British philosopher. And I'm picking up on part 2 of my video series on Locke here. So let this be an extension of part 2 of my video series on Locke. Call it, if you will, part 2B of my video series on Locke. So I've been discussing Locke's theory of the state of nature, and talking about what the state of nature is like and how it differs from the theory of state of nature developed by Thomas Hobbes. And I concluded my previous video discussion on Locke with an initial argument that Locke gives us for exiting the state of nature. So keep in mind that Locke, in thinking about this idea of the state of nature, he is ultimately trying to get at a justification of political authority and a justification of political obedience. Like, those are the goals, it seems, when we read Locke carefully, give him his best arguments. And so we see here that an initial reason, initial justification for leaving a state of nature to form a political society, and it's in leaving the state of nature to form a political society that we start finding, right, the justification for the authority in the first place. So it's with the reasons that are given for getting out of the state of nature that serve as the justifications for political authority in the first place. So that's an important thing to just keep in mind as we run through, not just one, but there'll be 3 justifications that Locke's can provide. So the initial justification involved thinking about the issue of partiality. Now, in a state of nature, everyone, as we know, given the prince-foreigner argument, has the right to enforce the laws of nature. That leads to people enforcing the laws of nature, but in a way that's ultimately unjust. Ultimately unjust in the sense that we tend to be favorable in our punishments towards those who are close to us, friends and family members, and we tend to be unfavorable, harsh, in our enforcements of the laws of nature against strangers, against those who aren't close to us. And so that serves as the initial justification. So keep in mind, enforcements of the laws of nature occur in both a state of nature and a political society for Locke. It's just that we're more likely, it's not necessarily the case, not absolutely the case, but we're more likely, it's a probabilistic game here, it's more likely that we're going to have impartial or more impartial enforcements of the laws of nature in a political society than in a state of nature. So that's the first justification. And what Locke says immediately on the heels of making this claim, offering us this justification for exiting the state of nature to form a political society, is that whatever we do, we must not form an absolute monarchy as a form of our political society. So we mustn't give any entity absolute authority, and that absolute authority mustn't be a monarchy. Why? Well, his justification for this claim falls on the heels of his discussion of bias and partiality in a state of nature. And what Locke wants to claim is that an absolute monarch is but a person, and then has a human nature that's going to be biased in the relevant ways. And so the absolute monarch will be very biased in his enforcement, or its enforcement, her enforcement of the laws of nature. Okay, so keep in mind that the justification for getting out of the state of nature, initial one, involves partiality, and he's claiming that an absolute monarchy would end up being a political society where there's too much partiality. So Locke even goes so far as to say that we're better off in a state of nature than forming an absolute monarchy, where you surrender all authority to a sovereign, to a rule, right, in a partial, biased way over others. Okay, at least according to Locke, in a state of nature, we can fend for ourselves. You give an entity absolute authority, good luck with that. So Locke is deeply opposed initially to the favored form of government by Thomas Hobbes, okay, for the reasons provided. Okay, so I think we're in a good position. We understand Locke's theory of the state of nature. We understand how it's different from that of Hobbes. We understand initial justification for exiting the state of nature to form a political society, and we see an initial justification for political authority. It involves the idea of political authority is more likely to be impartial or unbiased in its enforcement of laws of nature and state of nature compared to that of the enforcement in a state of nature. Okay, so the argument, though, continues. The justification continues. Why give one argument for exiting the state of nature when you can give two or three even? So Locke, in chapter 3 of the Second Treatise of Government, he begins developing his idea of the state of war, and he distances himself from Hobbes, as I've already noted, by claiming that the state of nature isn't necessarily a state of war, but it can include states of war. And on Locke's view, a state of war is a state where someone tries to force another beyond their right to do so. He gives other characterizations of it. They all seem to be sufficient conditions of some kind, but this very general sufficient condition will serve our purposes, or serve for our purposes. So state of war occurs when someone tries to put another or force another beyond their right to do so. So it's going to involve this idea of forcing. And on Locke's view, a state of war can occur in a state of nature or a political society. And so what we need to do is think about comparing states of war in a state of nature versus a political society. So on Locke's view, he thinks that it's pretty clear that states of war are going to be worse in a state of nature than in a political society. At least it's more likely to be the case that states of war are going to be worse in a state of nature compared to a political society. So why does he think this? Well, he thinks that in a state of nature, in many cases, what we're going to do when a state of war occurs, all we have recourse to do in many cases when states of war happen in a state of nature is just cry out to God for help. Like, God, please help me, and hope to get the help. Of course, there's no guarantee. In fact, it might not be very likely that you get any help in those circumstances from God anyways. God doesn't seem to be, on Locke's view, micromanaging the political or the societies, whether political or states of nature, in these ways. So what Locke says is that in a state of nature, states of war are likely to be more commonplace. I mean, there's more likely to be more of them in a state of nature compared to that of a political society. And the states of war are likely to last longer. And this is going to be because in a state of nature, we're not going to have the institutions in place. We're not going to have the law enforcement institutions in place to protect people. And the same goes for the first point, the fact that there won't be the relevant law enforcement officials around to prevent crime from happening in the first place, prevent states of war from happening in the first place, means that there's more likely to be more states of war in a state of nature compared to that of a political society. So there's likely to be more states of war, and they're likely to last longer. And again, this is related to the fact that there isn't going to be, in a state of nature, compared to that of a political society, or political societies, the relevant law enforcement institutions in place. So the last consideration is that very, very often when people are forced, they're wronged, they're harmed, and those harms seem to demand, by justice, to reparations. So when you're harmed relevantly, you're a victim, you deserve reparations for what the offender caused. And what Locke thinks is that you're more likely in a political society with its institutions, law enforcement institutions, etc., to get reparations when you are a victim compared to when you're in a state of nature. So on Locke's view, we have then this very general comparative claim to make, supported in the ways just provided. The state of war, given that it can occur in both state of nature and a political society, is likely to be worse in a state of nature, likely to be better in a political society, therefore. And so we need to exit, or we have at least more reason to exit the state of nature to form a political society. And again, it's for the sake of avoiding the severity of states of war in states of nature compared to that of political societies. Okay, so now we have two justifications on the table. And again, both involve comparative claims. The first involved thinking about partiality, the second involves thinking about states of war. Now keep in mind, Hobbes had a justification for exiting the state of nature that involved thinking about the state of war. He just thought that state of nature was a state of war. That's a terrible place for one to promote one's own good, and so it violated the egoistic nature of the natural law, and so that gave us justification for exiting the state of nature to form political society. Locke uses the state of war for justifying exiting the state of nature to form political society, but he just does so in a different way. So the last thing to note in terms of Locke providing justification for political societies forming and our exiting the state of nature involves thinking about property. And property is a robust notion. In Locke, I'm not going to go into it, but think about the things that you possess, just as a very general idea, thinking about property. But for our purposes, be thinking about how Locke thinks that in a state of nature, given that we have enforcers, and really enforcers everywhere, because everyone has the right to enforce the laws of nature and state of nature, property becomes possible. So you can own things in a state of nature, and this goes against Hobbes's view. Remember Hobbes's view in a state of nature, everyone has a right to everything because nobody has a political property right to anything. Locke says that's just false. In a state of nature, one can have property, and he develops a view of property that involves mixing one's labor with the land. So it's a more robust idea than you might ordinarily think of it as. It's more robust than even I've laid out even here, but he develops this idea of property being something that you can have in a state of nature. Again, there are enforcers of the laws of nature, which would allow us to have property and have property rights, etc. in a state of nature. And what Locke, after developing his theory of property quite a bit, he ends up claiming that that since we have property in a state of nature, we have property in a political society, we need to do some comparing. Where is our property more likely to be protected? Okay, you can guess more likely to be protected in a political society compared to in a state of nature. So that provides us with a third justification for leaving the state of nature to form political society. Okay, the idea that property, so it's a property consideration, that property is better protected or more likely better protected in a political society where we have the institutions to protect people's property in the first place compared to the protection of property in a state of nature, where in many cases in a state of nature all you're going to be able to do in some circumstances cry out to God, cry out to whoever might be listening, please help me, and you hope to get the help in those circumstances. But in many cases, right, those are just wishes. There's no justification for you getting the help in many of those circumstances. So Locke then gives us those three reasons for exiting the state of nature, and he ends up claiming that when we exit the state of nature and form political society, we're doing what Hobbes said we do. What we do as, say, citizens is we surrender the rights that we would have in a state of nature to a sovereign to rule, and there's a very general agreement that's made between us and other subjects, other citizens, a kind of horizontal agreement. But Locke thinks that the original contract has one other feature that's different from what Hobbes thought. He thought there was also what I call a vertical agreement, an agreement between the sovereign and the citizens. And so what I'll do in my next video on Locke is pick up with discussing this vertical agreement that Locke thinks exists between the sovereign and the citizens. Thanks for watching, everybody.